Hello everyone. Today's topic is the same topic that we're going to cover for not only today but next time. The question of the separation or the not separation of church and state in the Middle Ages. So this is called Kings and Popes. Let's talk a little bit about the church versus state divide. During the 12th and 13th century, kings around Europe were attempting to reorganize the state in order to make it more powerful. They used centralization, which we've talked about before, and legitimacy as ways of doing that. But they also extended their control over the church as far as they could. Now, not surprisingly, this is resisted by the church, and the church attempts to regain control of for example, the office of bishop through investiture, but other things as well. It's worth remembering that state interests can be divided between nobles and the king. You would think that the common people would have something to say about that, but at this point, we don't hear very much from common people. Today's example is going to come from England. Next time, our example will come from France. But basically, the issue is the same. Who has power? Who has power over the church? Who has power over the king, if anyone? To start with this story, we'll talk about Henry II, the King of England from 1154 to 1189. Those are his regnal dates. And a man named Thomas Becket. This is sort of a cool story, so I'll go ahead and tell it. Henry II obviously grew up as a prince, and one of his friends, who was brought in to play with young Henry, was this young man named Thomas Becket, who was from a merchant family, and they became best friends, the very best friends that they could possibly be. When Henry became king in 1154, he had the bright idea that he could use his friend to run some of the government for him. So Becket was made the Chancellor of England, which is kind of like the Secretary of the Treasury. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury happened to die. The Archbishopric of Canterbury is the highest church office in England at this time. And it was common for the kings of England to make the choice of the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though the church law basically said they shouldn't. The way this worked was that the canons of the Cathedral of Canterbury would usually elect anybody that the king told them to elect. And Henry had the bright idea that he would propose his friend Thomas Becket, who was not only not ordained to the priesthood, but had nothing to do with the church previously whatsoever, to become Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was duly elected by the canons of the cathedral. Henry then passed a number of laws that made it very difficult for Becket to continue to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, notably the 1164 Constitutions of Clarendon. Now I want you to think about these in the light of the investiture controversy, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The first point in the Constitutions of Clarendon that caused a problem was that the bishops of England would do homage to the king. Now remember that the idea that the bishops would do homage to the king for their investiture was something that had been very controversial back in the 11th century, and here it is being controversial again. Clerks accused of crimes, people who were church professionals accused of crimes, were to be tried by both church and royal courts. Remember the difference between church courts and royal courts. Normally, if you were a clerk and you had been accused of a crime, you would be tried by the church court. This came out because there was a very famous murder. There was a churchman accused of murdering a man, and the king wanted to try him in the royal court for murder, claiming this is a serious enough crime that it belongs to the royal courts. And the church courts said, no, we get to try any court cases that are over people who belong to the church. The bishops were also not allowed to appeal to the Pope, so if the king did something that the bishops didn't like, they couldn't go over his head and ask the Pope to fix it. All three of these points were points of contention between Henry II and his very best friend in the whole wide world, Thomas Becket. But Becket suddenly became extremely pious and decided to resist the king's attempts to levy control over the church. The tension between them grew, and it became so serious that the story goes, one day Henry was deep in his cups, kind of drunk, and he had a bunch of his men around him, and he said, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" So 3 of his men took that as an order, went up to Canterbury to the cathedral, found Becket celebrating Mass there, and chopped his head off. The idea that the king would cause the assassination of the most important archbishop in England was deeply troubling to just about everybody, and there was a public outcry. When news of Becket's death came to Rome, he was almost immediately sainted. And as we've talked about before, his tomb becomes a very prominent place of pilgrimage for people in England. You might remember we talked about the Canterbury Tales as well as some other things. So in this case, it would seem that the state has won some control over the church, but that would not be the case because Henry was made excommunicate by the Pope after this murder, and he was forced to do penance, not only for Becket's death, but for trying to pass the constitutions of Clarendon. So he was forced to drop all the things that the Constitution of Clarendon had guaranteed to him. The second story I want to tell you is the story of King John, who was king from 1199 to 1215, versus Pope Innocent III. You'd be surprised how easily the story picks up in 1205. The Archbishop of Canterbury of that time died, and John, who was King of England, decided to select a replacement. Something strange happened at this point, though. The canons refused to elect his candidate and instead selected a candidate of their own. This candidate immediately left England and went to Rome in order to get the Pope's support for his election against the king. But the Pope, Innocent III, did not allow that candidate to become Archbishop of Canterbury, but instead selected one of his cardinals, a guy whose name was Stephen Langton. He was English by birth. Stephen Langton traveled up to France and was trying to get a ship across to come to England, but John refused not only to accept him as Archbishop of Canterbury, but refused to let him in the country. So he was consecrated, he was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1207 in France. The Pope was mighty unhappy with King John for refusing to let his chosen archbishop into the country. And so in 1208, he placed England under interdict, and John was made excommunicate. Let me explain the word interdict. A country that's under interdict is forbidden to have any religious services performed except for burial and baptism. So people could not get married. They were not supposed to be able to be consecrated as priests. The whole church system in England was placed on hold. And John was made excommunicate. John was not a popular king. And for some of his barons, it was a great excuse to rise up against him. That civil war lasts from 1213 to 1215 and ends with the signing of a document called the Magna Carta, which is the foundation of English common law after this period. We are going to talk deeply about Magna Carta in class. This is a copy of the original Magna Carta. There are 4 extant copies, all of which are in England. 2 belong to the British Library, 1 belongs to Lincoln Cathedral, and the other one belongs to Salisbury Cathedral. This one, as you can see, has had a rather rough life and has been damaged in the intervening years. The significance of Magna Carta is very high. What it argues is that the king, like everyone else in the kingdom, is subject to the law. So the law is not something that the king can make up and promulgate over his entire country without being bound by it himself. He has to be bound by the law himself. And as we will see, there's an explicit discussion of the king's duties to the nobles in the Magna Carta. Not so much to the people per se, though there is a section of the Magna Carta which talks specifically about everyday people, as we will see. The other significance of the Magna Carta is that it argues that the king must be advised, that he can't just do whatever he wants, he needs to be advised by his nobles. Now, the nobles are basically the authors of the Magna Carta, along with Stephen Langton, and not surprisingly, they tried to take some of the king's power for themselves. The word parlamentum, which comes to be the word parliament, just simply means a meeting. But King Edward I of England, and you can see his dates there, made a habit of calling the parliament to advise him for mandates, for taxes, and for laws. So this is before, but the very first inkling that there's going to be a parliamentary system in England.